A while back I did a video on what are called the underlying tendencies of the mind, these tendencies that make our life more difficult in various ways, that cause us harm, that are unskillful. And one of these is called clinging to rules and rituals, or clinging to rites and rituals. I discussed a little bit of that at the time, but I want to go into a little bit more detail on today's video about what that really is and how it might manifest in our lives. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org, where you can find videos, courses about early Buddhism and early Buddhist Dharma. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. Now, the underlying tendencies, there's a number of them. One of these is this underlying tendency, which is called clinging to rules and rituals. And now, it's also considered one of the three fetters that binds us three lower fetters that binds us to reality. It's called one of the four kinds of clinging. It comes up in a number of different lists of unpleasant or unskillful kinds of states or tendencies that we have. But what is it? I mean, it does seem important because it comes up in all these different lists, but what is it? Well, in a nutshell, this tendency of clinging to rules and rituals is part of our general tendency towards what's called views. In other words, we have a tendency to come up with views about things, with opinions, beliefs. We can indeed become quite opinionated, as many of us know. And one of these views is this view about rules and rituals. And indeed this is sort of two related views. The first view is that simply by following certain kinds of rules, by, let's say, acting ethically, by acting in a certain pure way, we can reach the goal, we can become enlightened, that the goal really is satisfied by our following a certain kind of path of rules. The other part of this is that the same is true of rituals. If we only fulfill certain ritual obligations, certain kinds of perhaps devotional practices, if we are able to say the right kinds of speeches or recite the right kinds of poetry at the right time or perform the right sacrifices, whatever it might be, that thereby we can become enlightened, we can reach the goal. Now, the Buddha seems to have gotten this, or at least one thought from many scholars is that this idea of clinging to rules and rituals comes from the Buddha's experience with what's called Vedic Brahmanism. Now, Vedic Brahmanism was a view at the day, a religious view, a philosophical view that persisted, was pre-Buddhist. It eventually developed into Hinduism, but at the time, it was basically a belief based around the Vedas, which are sacred texts of these groups, which expressed a number of different ritual performances that one had to, or that in particular the Brahmin caste had to follow. Certain kinds of sacrifices, fire sacrifices, certain kinds of ritual statements that they had to make, the expressions of certain kinds of formulas, chants, that had to be said precisely correctly and pronounced correctly in order to have the right effects. And it's said that all of these rituals could provide us great benefit within our lives. That was the main point of them. But they could also, in the days of the Buddha, began to be understood that they could also provide potential benefits for us in future lives. And it seems, perhaps, that some may have also believed that by performing the same kinds of rites and rituals, one could thereby become enlightened. One could reach the religious goal, the goal of enlightenment or of freedom by doing these rites and rituals. Now, I say this in terms of ritual performances because that's often how They're understood in Vedic Brahmanism, but they also can be understood in terms of ethical behavior as well. The Brahmin also felt that they had to perform ethically, that part of their Dharma in life was to live ethical lives. And the same thing could be understood for the rest of us. In other words, we might not, potentially we might say we don't really care about rituals, but we do care about living ethically, and that perhaps by living an ethical life, that's enough, that's sufficient. It may also be, and this is, I think, part of clinging to rules and rituals, is a kind of an ossification or a hardening around the form of the rule. So, for example, we can think of the case of the person in Nazi Germany who's hiding potentially a Jewish person, let's say, in their house, and the SS man comes and knocks at the door. The question is, how do we answer their question? In other words, if the SS man's going to ask us, is anybody else in the house except us? Are we hiding anybody? Is anybody hiding here? Now we have two options. If we're going to cling to the rule, the literal rule of never lie, then we're going to have to say, yes, there's somebody else in the house. There's a Jewish person here. That will condemn them, of course, to an almost certain death. So the question is, to what extent is this an example of clinging to rules and rituals? For myself, I would say it's a clear example of that. It's an example where the following the rule ends up hurting somebody, ends up causing real harm when otherwise no harm needed to be done. And presumably, and I think this almost goes without saying, the ethical rules in Buddhism, and indeed in every form of life, are done as general rules of thumb because they're ways that we can be kinder and more compassionate to other people. However, there are going to be cases like the one I just mentioned where everything gets reversed, where performing the rule as stated actually becomes uncompassionate, becomes unkind, becomes harmful. Now, these are, of course, very small number of cases, but nevertheless they exist. And so it can be that we can cling to the rule without really understanding the point of it. We can also cling to these rules and rituals as forms of conceit. That is to say, we feel ourselves to be pure. We reflect upon the fact that we, let's say, are ethically perfect, or we believe that we are ethically beyond reproach. And so we lord it over other people. These other people are not behaving ethically, we are better than them. And this is known in Buddhism as a form of conceit. A conceit itself is a kind of underlying tendency which is itself harmful. And this is another way that I think we can cling to rules and rituals. We can believe ourselves ethically pure, and as a result, invest our sense of self, our sense of ownership, with this kind of notion of purity. And that itself is damaging. It's damaging because it reifies ourself as something unchanging, as something pure and better than other people. But in all of these cases, the idea here is that we have this viewpoint that either acting in a certain way, doing certain kinds of ritual performances, these are the sorts of things that can get us enlightened. But in fact, enlightenment really has nothing to do directly with our external performances of certain things. Instead, it has to do with a complete sort of re-evaluation and turning around of our internal emotional state. That's the essence of what it is to be enlightened. And so it's not so much that we might say it's because of performing all these ethical deeds that the person becomes enlightened, but rather the reverse. It's that by becoming enlightened, that is to say, by entering into a state which is typified by a true purity of kindness and compassion and selflessness, that we enter into a state in which we cannot act in a way that's unethical, in a way that violates at least the spirit of the Buddhist precepts, these rules that we are supposed to follow in Buddhism. So the point is that the ethical behavior comes from an internal purity, not the reverse. Now, the other question, I mean, I've talked about ethical purity here, but the other question is then, if the enlightened person is going to be somebody who behaves ethically as a sort of a natural state, they're going to be somebody who behaves kindly and compassionately, are they also going to be the sort of person who performs ritual observances, right? Because that seemed to be also part of this whole issue. And that is indeed an interesting question, because ritual observances are at least typically the sorts of things that involve devotion to external beings. They sort of propitiation of external beings who are going to help us in various ways. And these kinds of devotional practices are indeed, at least in early Buddhism, the sorts of things that are really, I should say, quite interesting. The Buddha had some interesting kinds of conclusions about rituals in general. And I did an earlier video on rituals in early Buddhism, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider checking out my Patreon page. It's linked down below. And consider joining us. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.